the Second World War, Winston Churchill tried to describe the uncertainty surrounding Russia's actions and intentions. And he famously said, "It is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma." I've heard that line before, but I never knew where it came from. But it came from Winston Churchill. And people have remembered that line for decades because it perfectly captures the feeling of confusion. When you know something is important, but you can't quite make sense of it. Now, maybe you've had moments like that yourself. I'm sure you have. I have. You read the instructions 3 times and you still don't understand them. You listen to someone explain something, but somehow with each explanation, it makes you more and more confused. You nod politely in a conversation while thinking, I have absolutely no idea what he means. That's exactly the kind of atmosphere we walk into in John 16. In verse 16, Jesus says to his disciples, "A little while, and you will see me no longer, and again a little while, and you will see me." And the disciples immediately begin whispering among themselves. What does he mean? What is this little while? We don't know what he's talking about. To them, it sounded like a riddle wrapped in a mystery. So what did Jesus mean when he said, "A little while, and you will not see me, and again a little while, and you will see me"? Well, that phrase, "a little while," you may have noticed it appears repeatedly throughout this section. And in fact, it's language that Jesus has used several times already in the Gospel of John. Chapter 7, verse 33, he says, "I will be with you a little longer, and then I am going to him who sent me." Chapter 12, verse 35, "The light is among you for a little while longer." Chapter 13, verse 33, "Little children, yet a little while I am with you." And chapter 14, verse 19, "Yet a little while, and the world will see me no more, but you will see me." So Jesus had been preparing his disciples for his departure all along. But even after hearing these statements again and again, his disciples still don't understand. Now, earlier in chapter 16, Jesus said that sorrow had filled their hearts, and now confusion fills their minds. Sorrow and confusion. You can listen to their response in verses 17 and 18, after Jesus talks about a little while and you will see me no longer, and again a little while and you will see me. So, verse 17, some of his disciples said to one another, "What is this that he says to us? A little while, and you will not see me, and again a little while, and you will see me, and because I am going to the Father." So they were saying, "What does he mean by a little while? We do not know what he is talking about." We can hear the bewilderment in their voices. And I think we can understand why they're confused. So what does the first, to get to their questions, what does the first little while refer to? And what is the second little while? What's he talking about? What does that refer to? Well, I believe the best understanding is this, that the first little while refers to the short time before the crucifixion. So there would be a little while until Jesus is crucified, until he dies on the cross and he is buried. So when he is buried, they would see him no longer. But then there's the second little while. The second little while, I believe, refers to the time after the resurrection, when they would see him again, alive from the dead. And so there's that first little while, and then there's that second little while. They wouldn't see him, but then they would see him again. So the sorrow of the crucifixion would give birth to the joy of the resurrection. Now let's continue. Verse 19. Jesus knew that they wanted to ask him, so he said to them, "Is this what you are asking yourselves, what I meant by saying, 'A little while, and you will not see me, and again a little while, and you will see me'?" So Jesus knows what they're talking about. He knows why they're confused. I remember learning in English class about oxymorons. Does anyone remember that? An oxymoron? Kind of a funny sounding word. But an oxymoron is a figure of speech that joins together two ideas that seem contradictory. I got a few examples for you. There's jumbo shrimp, deafening silence, bitter sweet. So two words, two ideas that appear contradictory or opposites, joined together. Two things that don't seem to belong together. And that helps us understand the disciples' confusion here, because in their minds, crucified Messiah sounded like an oxymoron. The reason why they didn't anticipate this is because it just didn't make sense in their minds. The Messiah was supposed to conquer, reign, and deliver Israel, and crucifixion was associated with shame, defeat, and rejection. So in their minds, the Messiah couldn't be crucified. That would be impossible. And someone crucified couldn't possibly be the Messiah. So to them, those ideas simply don't fit together. And so that's why Jesus' words sounded so confusing to them. What he was saying couldn't fully make sense unless you understood something that they hadn't grasped. And that is, the Messiah would suffer, he would die, and then he would rise again. Let's go on to verse 20. Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you, you will weep and lament, but the world will rejoice. You will be sorrowful, but your sorrow will turn into joy." So the disciples, you could say, expected a crown without a cross. They expected glory without suffering. But they didn't yet understand that the cross was the pathway to resurrection joy. And we can struggle with the same kind of thinking today. Sometimes the phrase suffering Christian feels like a contradiction. We might say, well, if God loves me, why am I suffering? If I belong to Christ, why is this happening? If Jesus overcame the world, why does life still hurt? So we assume sometimes that sorrow and the Christian life don't belong together. But Jesus says that they do, for a time. We've seen this already in this farewell discourse, as it's called. He's talked about sorrow. He's talked about being hated by others. He's talked about that rejection. And so we do experience sorrow in this life. The Bible does talk about the suffering Christian. But the sorrow we experience is temporary. It was temporary for Jesus, It was temporary for the disciples, and it will be temporary for us. And that's why 2 Corinthians 4:18 says the things that are seen are transient. The things that happen right now are temporary, including the suffering, the disappointment, the pain. These things are transient, temporary, but Paul says the things that are unseen are eternal. We read that earlier. And in the context, what he's saying is that affliction is temporary, while glory is eternal. And then there's that verse we started with, Psalm 30, verse 5. It reminds us, weeping may tarry for a night, but joy comes with the morning. Now, for some believers, that morning comes in this life, in all sorts of different ways. The sorrow doesn't last a lifetime, but for others, it does. But for all believers, it will fully arrive on the last day when Christ returns. We have the promise that there is a morning of joy coming. And so Jesus says that your sorrow will turn into joy. And he gives an illustration of this in verse 21. Would have been nice if this was the passage for last week, Mother's Day. Would have lined up perfectly, but it didn't quite line up perfectly. But we're getting this 1 week late, where it mentions a woman or a mother. Verse 21, when a woman is giving birth, she has sorrow because her hour has come. But when she has delivered the baby, she no longer remembers the anguish for the joy that a human being has been brought or has been born into the world. So, obviously, I haven't experienced this. Some of you have. And you know that the pain of childbirth is real. I've been there in the room, so I could witness that, though I did not feel it. It is real, the pain. It's intense. It can be exhausting and overwhelming. But when the child is finally placed into the mother's arms, then the joy eclipses the anguish. So the pain is no longer viewed in the same way because something beautiful has come through it. A baby boy or a baby girl. And so the sorrow has turned into joy. So that's Jesus' point here. The disciples were about to experience deep sorrow, as we sometimes do. They would watch their Lord crucified and buried. And for a moment, it seemed like hope died with him. At that point, they didn't realize that there was a resurrection morning coming. And that's why Jesus says in verse 22, so also you have sorrow now. As Jesus was talking about departing or leaving them, they would see him no longer for a little while. They have sorrow. You have sorrow now, he says, but I will see you again, and your hearts will rejoice, and no one will take your joy from you. Of course, that's exactly what happened. The resurrection morning came. Matthew 28, verse 8. When the women, they don't actually see Jesus at this point, but they see that the tomb is empty. And it says, so the women departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy and ran to tell his disciples. Great joy. Luke 24:41, talking about the same thing. The women see, the disciples see the empty tomb. And it says, while they still disbelieved for joy and were marveling. They disbelieved for joy. In other words, this seemed to be something too good to be true. They disbelieved for joy. John 20:20, Jesus showed them his hands and his side. Then the disciples were glad when they saw the Lord. Kind of sounds like a bit of an understatement, but their sorrow had turned to joy. They were glad when they saw the Lord. And then Luke 24:52. This is after the ascension. After Jesus has risen from the dead, he has ascended to heaven, and it says, and they worshiped him and returned to Jerusalem with great joy. Before that, there was a lot of sorrow. Jesus betrayed, arrested, crucified, buried, dead. And they didn't see him for a little while. But then the resurrection morning came, and they saw him again. And their sorrow turned into joy. Finally, let's look at verses 23 and 24. We've seen similar statements here in this farewell discourse already about prayer, and we won't take long to talk about this. But again, Jesus isn't saying that prayer is like a blank check, that it's supposed to be all about our selfish desires, a wish list. It's not that. But looking at verses 23 and 24, I want to focus on really what Jesus says first here. He says, in that day you will ask nothing of me. Truly, truly, I say to you, whatever you ask of the Father in my name, he will give it to you. Until now, you have asked nothing in my name. Ask and you will receive, that your joy may be full. And so again, he talks about joy, fullness of joy. But he says, in that day you will ask nothing of me. Jesus might mean that after his resurrection, the disciples' confusion will finally begin to lift. The things that once sounded like riddles will start to make sense. They will understand that he was speaking about his death, resurrection, and return to the Father. So their sorrowful questions will give way to resurrection understanding. Now, we understand that. We now understand. The disciples in that moment, they didn't understand what Jesus really was talking about in verse 16. But when that resurrection morning came, they understood. Now, in many ways, we're still living in the tension between questions and answers. We still ask, why did this happen? Why does suffering last so long? Why does God sometimes seem silent? Why does following Christ still involve sorrow? And of course, we long for answers. We want everything to make sense. So we can relate to the disciples' confusion that we read of in John chapter 16. But Jesus reminds us again in this passage that our sorrow, confusion, and disappointments are temporary. They won't last forever. There's coming a day when faith will become sight. A day when sorrow, every sorrow, will be undone. A day when everything that felt confusing will make sense in the light of God's glory. And on that day, there won't be partial joy, not a fragile joy, not temporary joy, but full joy. The disciples' sorrow gave birth to resurrection joy. And because Jesus rose from the dead, our sorrow if our faith is in him, our sorrow will one day give way to everlasting joy as well. So the message is, or what I want to emphasize is, don't lose heart in the night of sorrow. The morning isn't just coming, it's guaranteed.